Thank you very much for joining us for our last session of the afternoon. This will be presented by Anna-Liza Badaloo and entitled Our Fairness Concerns Preventing Equity Action, Moving Towards a Culture of Accessibility. Anna-Liza Badaloo, who uses she, her pronouns, is the founder of Anna-Mockery Consulting, which is an organizational justice practice. She helps organizations uncover how colonial harms show up in the workplace. By leveraging empathy with a decolonized, intersectional lens, she amplifies traditionally silenced voices and fosters inclusive workplaces where all employees feel a sense of belonging. With that, I would like to hand it over to Anna-Liza.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for that introduction. And thanks to Realize Canada for having me here today. Really delighted to speak with you all. And I understand we're going a little bit later than planned today. I believe till about 3:20, 3:25 for this presentation. So thanks to Realize Canada for realizing that goal, if you will.
Thanks.
Really happy. Oh, of course, of course. Melissa, I'm here on the speaker side of things today, but as a fellow moderator, I appreciate the difficulty. We want to make sure that we answer as many questions as possible, of course. So with that, welcome everyone. As Melissa mentioned, my name is Anna-Liza Badaloo. My pronouns are she and her. And we're here today to talk about what I used to have a colleague that called this the other four-letter word, and that word is fair, F-A-I-R. This is something that doesn't get talked about quite enough in these discussions. And sometimes we talk about fairness in terms of how to inform our policies, how to inform our cultures of accommodation. But sometimes fairness has a dark side to it too, and it can get in the way. So that's what we're here to talk about today. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. A little bit about me. I have some intersections here today, and there's a couple of reasons I'm sharing this with you. One of them is because as I'm going through these, I'd really like you to think about where may your own intersections lie. Because one of the things that's hard for us in this is actually figuring out where do we have areas of privilege, because we always have areas of privilege. So for myself, I'm a racialized person, specifically Indo-Caribbean, and specifically from Trinidad and Tobago, two little islands in the Caribbean. I do identify as a woman, and I do identify as queer, specifically pansexual. I also identify as neurodiverse. I happen to be the very first generation of my family that was born in Canada, and I consider myself a young Gen Xer. A little bit later, I'm going to talk about intergenerational approaches to how we talk about workplace accommodations and cultures of accessibility. So that's why I'm pointing this out here. And also, I am a person with an episodic disability. Now, I presented at this conference, it was almost exactly a year ago. And just to give you a nature or like a little flavor of the nature of episodic disability, when I was here last year, I did not consider myself a person with an episodic disability. And in the intervening year, I've learned some things about my health that have made me realize actually I am. I struggle quite a bit with areas of fatigue. I struggle quite a bit with things like foggy thinking, lack of concentration. So these are things that I'm now coming to terms with that myself. And this is a relatively new thing for me. So thought I'd share that with you here today as well. So in terms of the actual work I do work at that intersection of health, environment, and social justice. And one of the things I do is work with a group called the Sustainability Network, and I'm leading their JEDI programs there. Just to clarify, not talking about Jedi in the Star Wars sense here, but as in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's in the nonprofit sector mostly that I work with them. And then I work with, the for-profit sector as well. And with the consulting firm I have, Anna-Mockery Consulting, essentially, as Melissa mentioned, this is what I'm doing. Really looking to bring empathy into these conversations, to take a decolonized and importantly, an intersectional lens and really amplifying voices. And the goal here, of course, is always belonging, right? Wanting to help organizations, help employers, just like yourselves, really set up that situation where employees really do feel that sense. So the very first thing I want to talk about today is psychological safety, but I'm going to talk about this in a way that might be a little bit different than you're used to hearing about it. Psychological safety is, boy, this term is thrown around a heck of a lot, right? Sometimes it's thrown around accurately, but I the sense I have these days is it's kind of become where the word intersectionality has been and is now, where people are just talking about this, throwing the word around like candy. So my personal definition that I find most helpful of psychological safety is in a workplace, if you have a workplace culture, an organizational culture, an environment where people actually do feel safe to express their opinions, to express their perspectives, to be their true selves. A really important part of that definition, though, is that they feel safe and, expressive to do all those things without fear of reprisal and without fear of punishment. Now, that is perhaps the most important thing that you can say there. So where does evolution come into this? Well, let's dig into this a little bit and see what perspective I can share with you. So, as humans, we have a lot of talk these days about human-centered this and human-centered organizational cultures. And the thing is that I'm actually going to take one step back in a little bit from where humans sit with this, because it's not exclusive to humans. And if you needed to hear that today, fairness is something that applies to pretty much any social mammal. So when we think about ourselves as a social species, it's a very, very important part of the workplace conversation that we are a social species. And the story goes that way back when, and we're talking like evolutionary time, millennia ago, wasps were actually one of the first species to become truly social. So that story goes that female wasps, which were mainly ground nesting, they're digging their holes in the ground. That's where they have their young, they're raising their young. Well, pretty early on, they realized that, if there's some other female wasps around, then it's more safe. Then I can go out hunting as a female wasp and not worry about what's going on at home, because I know some other females are going to be around there to keep an eye on the situation. That's kind of where it all began. And over time, we've become more and more and more social, right? So I wanted to state this to you because I want everybody, if you take only one thing from this presentation, I want it to be that safety is incredibly central to who we are. We are constantly scanning our environment for safety. We're constantly assessing in any given situation in the workplace and out. Are we safe? Are these people safe? Is this environment safe? Where's the exit? We're constantly doing this. And at first, way back in our evolution, this was to protect ourselves, kind of in the example I gave, from other animals. We were running from saber-toothed tigers and all kinds of animals. Humans, we pretty much have got that situation under control now. But we have another problem because we've become so social. Our very own species has become so diverse that the new question is, how do we protect ourselves from other humans, right? That we may deem dangerous. And then that leads us to the other question, very important one. So who is safe in our society? Who is worthy? And the answer to that is that our culture tells us this information. And what does this look like? What are we actually learning from our culture? Well, this is where it comes down to internalizing cultural beliefs. Now, I know this is a very savvy group. I'm sure that you've heard this term before, and you've probably been through many types of, shall we say, unconscious bias training. In my personal opinion, it is a lack of discussing this. This is why a lot of unconscious bias training fails and a lot of unconscious bias training works, because it's not an intellectual process, right? So we can talk about what cultural internalization is, but that's not actually how we experience it. It's not a logical process. So the way that I think about it is it's kind of what is safe before you have a chance to think about it intellectually, right? As we grow up, right, the environment we grow up in, the world we grow up in, that really impacts our neurology. And again, this is not what we logically think. This is what our neurology, what our bodies, our spirits, the whole package. It's what we've learned. And I want you to know that this process of internalizing cultural beliefs, inherently, it's not a bad thing because we kind of have to do it. That's our job as humans, right? We have to learn what our culture is. What are the rules? What's good and bad? Who's good and bad? And when we learn this as we're growing up and our neurology is developing in our very, very early years, we end up having this gut response, right, to who's safe and who's not. And this is where also the generational experiences come in, because if you're learning from your culture, culture changes. And I'll give you an example of that. If we take September 11th as an example, we have, here today a wide range of ages. Myself, again, being a young Gen Xer, I was an adult when, 9/11 happened. Actually, I was working right down the street from the American embassy, and we had to evacuate. By the time that happened, my experiences, my idea of what a Muslim individual is, that was pretty much set. So to be honest, our whole culture has become incredibly Islamophobic as a result, not only of that one incident, but things that have happened since then. But I have a very different view than somebody who grew up maybe before 9/11 or maybe was really young. And again, the point I want to make here is these are not intellectual beliefs. This is just how we grow up. And the question is, how do we uncover these things? Because it happens when you're not thinking. It happens like that in milliseconds. And the answer to this is we have to inculcate the skill of watching what we think and then just watching it without judging it. Because if we feel a thought and we're like, oh, this person is this person is that, it's not that helpful if we automatically judge ourselves because then we can't reflect upon it. So this is the kind of thing that I certainly want to encourage people about. And I'm going to use another example. In this culture right now, because we live in a white supremacy culture, very unfortunately, we believe, again, not intellectually, but as a culture, that Black individuals are dangerous. This is what we believe. We can see this in a variety of things, whether it's the, disproportionate incarceration rates, whether it's police brutality, whatever it is, but we can also see this in the workplace. And these are things that is based on how I grew up, right? But if we were to go back generations before that, and many people have written some great academic papers about this, what we consider a Black individuals now dangerous, as I say, that wasn't always the case. Right? There were decades and decades where Black individuals were like entertainers, right? And considered people there to entertain us. And I realize this is a controversial view, but I want to make the point that the culture that we grow up in, whether we like it or not, it does impact us and it does impact what we think. And fairness comes into this too. So everything I just said, let me just back up a sec. Think about, how do we think about people with disabilities? With permanent disabilities, with episodic disabilities, and I'm not going to answer that question right now, but I'd like you to think about it. Now, in terms of evolution, fairness really comes into this because, again, as social animals, as we get deeper into being social animals, we need to know how are we being treated compared to other people around us. And this is where we can see this in the workplace, right? If any of you have kids, or if any of you have spent even a short amount of time speaking with children, you will know that they are obsessed. Kids are obsessed with fairness. The biggest tantrums, the biggest conflicts, it is because a child is trying to learn, right? What is fair in this culture? If there's a tantrum, it's often because a thing happened and it's really, it's really not fair. It's just really not fair. I also just want to address a comment in the Q&A, which I really appreciate, actually. The person was saying, I don't appreciate the speaker using blanket statements to apply to a group, like a racial group or the color of their skin. It just perpetuates discrimination, and I don't appreciate being told what I do or do not believe. Well, I really appreciate that comment because I absolutely don't want to tell you what to believe. What I'm doing is using some examples. And the fact is that unfortunately, we do live in a white supremacy culture. And by that, what I mean is that white people are supreme. And again, I use that as an example because another thing I can say is that we live in an ableist culture, right? Which means that people that are considered able-bodied in some way are considered extreme. So I just wanted to clarify that point. And again, I really, really appreciate that comment and appreciate the question. So where does it come in terms of evolution? Well, it comes in a little bit. As I said, I want to back up even beyond humans. We as humans, I think, we put a lot of emphasis on how supreme we are, right? And it's very difficult for us to realize that we have more in common than we think with other animals. There is a researcher, I put her name on the screen here, and a link to her work as well, this is all she does. She studies fairness in primates and other animals. She did this really interesting experiment where there were two monkeys, they could see each other, they could see what they were getting. There was a lesser treat, which was a cucumber, and there was a greater treat, which was a grape. And what was really interesting is that if the monkeys could see they were both getting a lesser treat, like a cucumber, everyone's happy. If they saw they were both getting a greater treat, like a grape, everyone's happy. But if the one sees that they're getting a lesser treat, they're getting a cucumber, when another one's getting a grape, then that one getting the cucumber is like, nope, I'm out. I'm not doing that. So I just want to make the point here again that it's not even us as humans, it goes even deeper than that. And again, fairness is a process that we do have to go, with all the time. We're constantly doing it, whether we realize it or not. So the key here is really to try to bring some awareness to it. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip through a couple of these slides because you have them here. But just quickly, what this person's research means for humans is that essentially we're always trying to figure out how to work in partnership, right? So as she says here, if you're working with someone and they're constantly taking more than their fair share, it's time to find someone new. Now, in the workplace, you may not be able to find somebody new. So this is where conflict can arise. There's also a recognition that, if somebody's getting more out of something, that's going to cause a problem with the relationship. And maybe there's something that can be done about this, right? So this is really speaking to, these sort of employer-employee conversations. And also the fact, what this quote is indicating here too, is that when it comes to fairness, this really is the long game. We realize that fairness is the long game with each other. And we also realize that people, it really affects people, right? When they see it happening to other people, it's all a very rich tapestry. So we need to remember it's not just the fairness with ourselves, but it's also with other people. And then dominance is an important issue here. So again, in these studies, what they were finding is that the dominant individuals, when they see some kind of inequity, they actually tend to get more upset because they are not used to that, right? Usually everything's pretty gosh darn equitable for them, and they're usually getting the better outcome. And in the workplace, certainly it does happen that people with disabilities are certainly less likely, we know that from the statistics, to be in a dominant position, but they face more barriers, so also less likely to actually speak up. So in other words, what's happening is that in the workplace, we have people who are already an equity deserving group, people with disabilities, who are experiencing more unfairness, but who are in a situation where they actually can speak about it less. So that's a consequence that I think is very important to remember. And this is the question on the screen here is really the ultimate question to think about and answer. How are we able to foster organizational fairness, but also provide individual accommodations? So it's kind of like thinking about it as in, how do you feel individually about how you're being treated, but how do you feel also when you're looking and seeing how other people are being treated? And a big part of this question comes down to duty of care for the employer. And this is something that we all think about, hopefully, quite a bit. What is our duty of care? And then, of course, a really close second to that is how do we fulfill it? So just to remind you, according to the labor code here, part 2, this is the bare basic. And there's a heck of a lot more. Actually, we heard some of that in the last presentation, a lot more detail, but this is the bare minimum, right? Make sure that the health and safety of every person employed is protected while you're working. Something we talk less about is what the employee duties are, because employees have a duty too. So what's their duty? Well, a responsibility to take all reasonable and necessary precautions to ensure that their health and safety and that anyone else who may be affected by their work and activities is safe. So how do these things work together? Is this something that the employee can actually do when you think about it? When you think about somebody, especially a person with a disability who may have several barriers to speaking up, can they actually make sure that their health and safety is protected and everybody else? It's really, kind of a big thing, right? Are they even in a position where they feel safe to discuss these things with their employer, right? Never mind actually fulfilling that. So this is where something called the internal responsibility system comes in. This is in the labor code too. So what most people think it is basically having some kind of committee, right? Or at least having some type of, one representative. And you need that. But how it's actually supposed to work is not just having that structure. What that actually is supposed to be is a collaborative approach. It's supposed to be the employer and the employee working together to resolve these problems. Now, for some of us, this actually thinks, it's really quite difficult, right? To actually think about how to do this because it does require that psychological safety I mentioned. It does require having those conversations. And in fact, if this doesn't happen, this collaboration, then neither the employer nor the employee actually is really in a position to actually do what they are supposed to do under the very bare minimum of the labor code. So I want you all to hear this, because whatever this collaboration looks like in your workplace, the point is that it has to happen in some way, and the way it happens is what needs to be discussed, and the way it happens is what needs to be specific to your own workplace. Every workplace is different. So a really simple answer, the most basic one I think I can give to this, what's the duty of care, is, well, it's what Winston Churchill said, give us the tools and we'll finish the job. This has become a real union slogan as well, for good reason. And when you think about it, that's the basic job of an employer, right? The employees have agreed to do a job. The employer has said, great, you're going to do this job for us. We're going to make sure that you have the tools that you need to do that. But within this very simple statement are actually several complexities, right? In terms of people actually being able to feel that they can say what those tools are and actually inculcate that. But if we can answer this question, right, in whatever way that makes sense in our organizations, that is the thing that's going to move us from making these individual accommodations to actually moving to that true culture of accessibility. This is where I want to talk now about a few of the barriers, and these are the big ones that I see coming up that I think are really getting in the way here. One of them is equality versus equity. Now, I don't want to get too far into definitions here, but one really helpful way I've heard this spoken about is to use an example with shoes. There's actually a really good infographic out there that I saw on this recently. So let's say if you're taking an equality approach that you say, well, everybody needs shoes. So the equality approach says, we're going to give everybody the same pair of shoes. There you go. So that's easier, right? Because you just have one thing, but maybe not as effective, right? In terms of actually, again, giving people the tools they need to do the job. So where the equity perspective would come in is to say, yep, everybody needs shoes, but the same pair of shoes actually is not going to achieve the goal, the actual goal we're looking for. What they need is a pair of shoes that works for them, right? Maybe some people need a pair of shoes with orthotics. Maybe some people have fallen arches and they can't be wearing high heels, right? That's harder to implement, but I'm here to tell you that that is the way to go, and that is what's actually going to be more effective. So we'll talk a little bit about how to kind of break down these barriers. This is what really requires psychological safety, right? Because again, none of that internal responsibility system, none of that employer and employee duties can be met if people do not feel safe, right? To actually not only say what they need, but maybe how they need it. An interesting example that I saw, this, by the way, was pre-pandemic. That's an important point. There was a workplace who was looking at the transport issue, and they were saying to themselves, well, there's a few different situations. There's people that take transit, so maybe we can look into a transit pass for them. There's people that don't take transit, but they need parking. Let me just leave it at those two now before the work from home. That was a really interesting discussion because at first it came down to money. A lot of times I think, quite wrongly, that's what the question is. Is it fair in terms of money? Well, when you look at a transit pass versus the parking, that financially, it actually wasn't the same. But in terms of the end result, it did work for the employer. Some people got transit passes, some people got parking. And then there was the work from home. Because this was before the pandemic, we all remember how different those conversations were. There was a situation where somebody was working from home and that was not going over well with other people at all. And then it got sort of put into these other discussions about, well, if I work from home, then maybe I can save the employer money, on sort of some of these other things. So these are just some ways to think about it, right? How are you actually going to achieve not equality, but equity? How are you actually going to make sure that individuals have what they need, not what somebody else needs, but what they actually need to do the job? Now, this is the question that honestly, I think this is the biggest barrier to any, DEI, JEDI initiative failing. What about me? So here's what we do as humans, a very natural thing we do as humans. No sooner do we hear that somebody has had some vague difficulties in life, that somebody has had a hard time. No sooner do we hear that somebody has had it harder than we perceive, had it harder than us, then this is what we say, well, what about me? What about me, right? And what does that look like? It often sounds like this. Well, what about me? I didn't have it easy. Nothing was handed to me on a silver platter. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I've had a very difficult life. Well, I'm here to tell you that These two things can coexist. And we know this intellectually, but I want you to try to think about this in a heartfelt sense. Imagine the last time that happened to you, because this happens to all of us regularly. The last time that you were in a conversation, workplace or not, and somebody said something to you that caused you to say, what about me? What about me? Right? Because we get very defensive about this. And I say we because I include myself. We all do this. So again, just like when I was talking about the unconscious bias, what this means is the awareness and the willingness to examine your areas of privilege. I'll give you an example. In my consulting practice, I recently had a client who sort of came along and said, I'm a cisgendered straight white male without a disability. And it's come to my attention that because of my identity, I have a lot of blind spots. So I really want to see what's going on here, because with me, this is him talking, I grew up poor, but everything else, I'm very privileged. So no, nothing was handed to me on a silver platter, but I need to try to put that aside, because here's the thing. As soon as we have that defensive reaction, we are essentially silencing somebody else, right? So we need to make sure that we're saying it in such a way that is really getting across. And looking, essentially at the time, what I'd like to do is just very quickly wrap up with a few remarks. I'll leave this with you, but what I think I'd like you to think about is that there's two aspects of trust. As employers, there's the trust that you have in your staff, and just know that, everybody is looking at that, right? Back to work mandates are a good example of that, in the sense of, do you trust your staff when you're demanding that they come into work all the time? Probably not. And trust among staff is really different. So again, when staff see unfair treatment, not even with themselves, with other people, you have just as an employer proven what you're capable of. And people see that and people talk. So please remember that when it comes to episodic disabilities, this is so the case. This is so the case. Gossip and disability, unfortunately, go together hand in glove when it comes to the workplace. Wrap up with the tips. The seminar or this conference is looking at from knowledge to action. So knowledge-wise, have these ableist culture conversations in your organization. Please note, I'm not saying talk about whether we are in an ableist culture. That's not the conversation, right? The conversation is have those conversations in your organization. What is it that you saw on the show you were watching last night? What happened when you last had a conversation disability related with your family member? It's about talking about how these show up, because the world doesn't end at the doors of your workplace, right? Much as some people would like you to think so, it doesn't. Number two, always be unlearning and reframing. So again, when you have that moment that what about me? Think about it, because that probably means there's something that you need to unlearn and maybe reframe it. And until you do that, you're not going to be able to hear what that person's saying. And always be identifying, acknowledging, reflecting upon privilege, right? If we do not do these things with our privilege, we have no hope of actually being able to do good things with our privilege. And action-wise, I got to tell you all, communities of practice are the way to go. And I know that it doesn't always seem like the deliverable or the outcome that you're looking for, but I got to say, this is what moves the needle. This is what does it. You need to have these conversations. It's not about tacking on a 10-minute conversation to a staff meeting. Have a community where you're really discussing these issues and getting all the perspectives. And most importantly, basically sending that message to your staff that this is a safe space to have those conversations. Make sure you're doing it from the ground up and always be revising. Final tip, and I'll leave it here. Accessibility Media Inc. has this amazing program called Employable Me. If you're looking for a way to do a community of practice, just watch an episode or two of that show. And finally, I'll leave this with you here, which is one of my favorite quotes. And a bit of a spin through that last part, but I will leave it there.
Anna-Liza, this is Tammy. Thank you very much. From one Trinbagonian to the other. Thank you for sharing those pearls of wisdom. And of course, we would have loved to have time for a Q&A segment with you, but maybe it'll be next year. You seem to be a fixture on our speakers roster, so maybe there'll be time next year. Thank you so much again. And thanks to Melissa, the rest of the organizing committee. What a remarkable day one for our summit. A reminder that the videos of this summit will be uploaded to the Realize YouTube channel in June, as well as the certificates of attendance for those who have attended each all days session. And as we wrap up day one, we're inviting each of you to fill out a brief evaluation survey. These surveys are really critical to us as we plan these events, and to get a sense from you, what are your preferences and what are your concerns across the episodic disability community? Anna-Liza just spoke about communities of practice. We have ours here with respect to episodic disability. So the link for today's evaluation should be in the Zoom window. As a thank you to those who fill out the complete survey, you'll be entered into a draw. And at the end of the entire summit, one evaluation form will be randomly selected, and that person will receive a $100 President's Choice e-gift card. So for Summit Day 2 tomorrow, we look forward to seeing you. We will focus on the experiences of people with episodic disabilities and innovative approaches to support and programming. We'll begin again at 12 p.m. Eastern sharp. Please remember to complete the evaluation forms. Thank you for taking part today. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you tomorrow. Bye.